Okay, good morning. My name is Susan Aronson, and I'm a professor here at GW. And I'm pleased to welcome you to today's event on Internet governance and its future. I was lucky enough to go to Sao Paulo for Net Mundial. And from my vantage point, last week's conference was messy, confusing, and yet inspiring. Okay, as you probably know, the attendees developed a set of non-binding principles and a roadmap, but where was that roadmap telling us to go? That was really unclear. Many of the attendees left as confused as I. Hence, I'm eager to hear what our speakers in panel 1 and panel 2 have to say about that path. So we have many speakers, but we have left a lot of time for you to interact with those speakers, and we hope you will ask questions or challenge them in any way. Before we begin, I'd like to thank several individuals who made today's event possible. So David Viorst, could you wave? That would be great. Stephanie Duchesneau. I hope I did I mispronounce it? Okay. Hi, Stephanie. And Stephen Mueller found many of our speakers. Paul Brigner of the Internet Society North America, you can see him, he's webcasting, and he provided funding for today's event, for which we're very grateful. And my colleague, Kyle Renner, and his capable staff organized and set it up, as did the Internet Society. So thank you all. Before I introduce Tim Lordan, I'd like to introduce Raquel Gatto, who's going to make some remarks from the Internet Society.
Hello, thank you so much, Susan, for the introduction. Came out landing yesterday from Brazil, directly from Brazil. I'm very happy to be here sharing some of the thoughts coming out of Net Mundial. But I was here in this opening remarks to tell how cool DC chapter event is. So I was told to tell that. No, but serious, guys. The DC chapter is doing a really great job engaging local community into internet governance issues. Anyone who is not a member yet should join. I'm sure David can share a little bit more how you can do it. And so they serve in ISOC community also as an example for other chapters. This kind of talks they're holding today is a great example how to share with the community, how to build the dialogue, right? So I'm really glad to be here. Thanks DC chapter. Thanks GW for the opportunity, and we will hear a little bit more later. Thank you.
Thank you, Raquel. Okay, so I'm going to introduce our moderator, Tim Lordan, who I have not met before, and he's going to introduce, it's a pleasure. He's going to introduce the panelists, and I've asked the moderators to keep everybody's remarks to 10 minutes so we have plenty of time for audience discussions. Thank you, Tim.
Welcome, everybody. Thank you for coming. My name is Tim Lordan. I work for the Internet Education Foundation. I'm the executive director, and we have a couple of projects that we do. One of which is the Congressional Internet Caucus Advisory Committee briefing program that we do in the Capitol complex throughout the year on issues ranging from patent litigation to ICANN to copyright to broadband and net neutrality. So during that job, I put together a lot of these types of events for congressional staff, and they're usually more kind of broad and general, trying to get the rank and file staff to understand what the lay of the land with regard to these issues. It used to be very easy when we started, which was a year before ICANN was founded back in 1997. And the issues have just gotten so much broader, and so many more stakeholders have come to the table. It's really, really wonderful and fascinating to watch. The other project that we do a conference called the State of the Net Conference. And that's a kind of a broader, more general type conference, but again, we still work on these issues. And over the time, I've been able to kind of dabble in a lot of these different issues. And the one that I dabble in the least probably is kind of internet governance, largely because of the congressional work. Congress tends not to get too involved in these issues, and historically. And it usually is kind of run out of the NTIA and the State Department. And so we don't really do briefings, but on occasion, when we think that there is something that's happening in this space that Congress should kind of understand, we try to do a briefing, and that's my really only experience with the issue. Today, I've been kind of asked to moderate this panel, which is allow the speakers to kind of give 10 minutes of presentations on the 3 questions at stake here. What is the IANA function? What led to the U.S. decision to reduce its role in IANA? And what are the risks and opportunities associated with this fundamental change? From my perspective, my last job, I was asked to attend a meeting. It was the first ever meeting of ICANN in Boston. It was the inaugural meeting with Esther Dyson, and it was really quite a scene to behold. It was the first time that ICANN had met, and it was really fascinating, and I realized how passionate people are about domain names and internet functions. And then over the course of the years, we've done a variety of briefings, some of which with NTIA, some of which other stakeholders at the table, from the affirmation of commitments to the decision to allow the .xxx registry, and then more recently last week on this particular issue. So my job is really as a timekeeper. That's why I'm activating my watch here, and I'm allowing, I'll introduce all the panelists, and I'm gonna give them 10 minutes. If they wanna save the balance of their time to rebut, that's fine. I really encourage you to use the hashtag for Twitter, which is pound ISOC-DC. Whether you're here in the room or elsewhere, I'm gonna try to keep checking it. So if you have really good questions, that's great. If you wanna say things like that moderator is really great and masterful, or Fiona is brilliantly clear, feel free to do that too. So let me just introduce our panel really quickly. I have Fiona to my left, and we're going to go right down the table. Fiona Alexander, who is with the Office of International Affairs at NTIA at the U.S. Department of Commerce. Next to her is Pat Kane, who is the Senior Vice President of Naming and Directory Services for Verisign. Next to him is Richard Jimmerson, who is the Chief Information Officer for ARIN, which stands for American Registry of Internet Numbers. And then Steve DelBianco, who spoke on our panel, as did Fiona last week. He's the Executive Director of NetChoice. Milton Mueller at the very end, last but not least, and he is a professor at Syracuse University of School of Information Studies. How many of you are lawyers? That is amazing. That is absolutely amazing. I can't remember the last time I had a panel of non-lawyers, so this should be really fun. So why don't I just get going? Let me just start my watch here. No pressure, but we're just gonna go 10 minutes, and the 3 questions. What is the IANA function? What led to the U.S. decision to reduce its role? And what are the risks and opportunities? Oh, sorry.
That's okay. So I guarantee you I won't take the 10 minutes. I never do. A fast speaker anyway, and I think this is, if everyone can hear me, somewhat well-covered territory. But for a lot of the folks in the audience, I think some of this will be well-covered, and for those that aren't, please let us know. Maybe we can explain further. But the first question, what is the IANA function? So first of all, it's what are the IANA functions, because there's more than one. And I'll explain at a really top-line level. There are folks on the panel that are involved much more specifically than NTIA. But at a top-line level, basically, it's the administration of 3 databases. That's simply all we're talking about in terms of the IANA functions themselves. So it's the distribution of protocol parameters from the IATF. It's the allocation of IP numbers to ARIN and others in the RIR system. And it's the processing of updates to the authoritative root zone file that are then passed on to Verisign and Pat Kane to implement. So those are simply the IANA functions themselves. So your second question, what led the U.S. decision to reduce its role in the IANA functions? Well, I'll take folks back to 1997. So you're even before your trip to Boston to meet the ICANN meeting. So when all this was set up in 1997 and 1998, a decision was made then to privatize the management of the domain name system. The Department of Commerce was instructed to carry out these tasks. We did a series of consultations, produced a green paper and a white paper. The white paper often referred to as the statement of policy. And in that statement of policy, we indicated that we would, at the appropriate time, transition the IANA functions to NewCo, which is now ICANN. So this is, from our perspective, the following through of a process that we started in 1998, so 16 years ago. The question is, why now, and what's the timing? And from our perspective, we've been fairly clear there are 2 major drivers as to why we're doing it now. One is the improved maturity that we've seen in ICANN over the last 4 years since the Affirmation of Commitments. The Affirmation of Commitments set up these multi-stakeholder review processes of various parts of ICANN tasks, whether it was accountability and transparency, or review of ICANN core functions. And from NTIA's perspective and from the US government, we've seen improvements in ICANN through that process. The second trigger for us is the broader acceptance of from the international community of the multi-stakeholder model in and of itself. This is referenced and reflected in the successful, I think we're on number 8 or 9 Internet Governance Forum coming up. I should know this better. And then also, obviously, the great success of last week in Sao Paulo of NetMundial. We really saw, broad acceptance of this model as a construct. So that's the why we're doing it now. In terms of the risks and opportunities associated with the change, I think from our perspective, we see opportunity. We see an opportunity for the United States government to recommit itself to the multi-stakeholder model, to follow through on what we said we would do 16 years ago, and to really allow the stakeholders that are impacted in this process to determine what the next steps are. So with that, I will yield back the time.
Wow, that's awesome. So Fiona has 7 minutes on a balance of time. Pat,
I'm not sure I can do anything or talk about anything in 10 minutes, so I'll probably take some of Fiona's time if that's okay. No,
the gentlelady has to extend her time to you.
Exactly. So I do want to thank the Internet Society and George Washington University for hosting us here today and organizing this event. So as far as the IANA function itself, the part that Verisign plays is we are the root zone maintainer. So when Fiona talked about maintenance of the root zone, which has the directory of all the top level domains around the globe, we are the last hands that touch it before it goes out around the globe. So basically we take the authorized changes from the NTIA, publish the root zone, and sign the root zone with DNSSEC, so it's all cryptographically taken care of. We've been doing that service now for over 3 decades. So back before Boston, when it was Network Solutions, we actually perform that function. So I'm not going to talk about why the U.S. government wanted to do that, but I am going to talk about some of the risks that we see. And the areas that we see risks are it's possible to have a lack of continued focus on security and stability, which is really where Verisign is coming out in this particular process. The risk of an integrated political and operational structure, as well as a lack of external accountabilities as we move forward into the future. So if we take a look at security and stability issues, the U.S. government has had a long history of supporting security and stability modifications. I think DNSSEC is one of the best ones that we've seen happen in the last several years. And again, it's Verisign's greatest focus. We make no assumption as to what our future role is in terms of this root zone maintainer role. So we think that while the transition may happen, ICANN may take over this role. We don't have any assumption as to what our future role is, but we believe that whoever takes over this root zone maintainer role in the future should provide at least as good a service as Verisign has provided over the last several years. We don't want to see an organization introduce more risks into the process moving forward, and we look forward to our participation in that, hopefully. We're also a direct customer of the root zone. So when we publish the root zone, what I like to refer to as a first affected parties, GTLD operators, whether they are legacy GTLD operators or new GTLD operators, the country code top level operators as well as root zone operators. And so we believe that they're the ones that are first affected by the changes in this root zone. Everyone's affected on the net, or will be if the directories are not produced correctly. But we're the first ones that are affected, and so we have to provide services to our customers who have customers, et cetera. So we are very, very concerned about the ongoing security and stability and operation of that root zone. To that dependence on an accurate root zone, Verisign believes that the current structurally separated model must continue. So if you take a look at where we are today, and in their role within IANA, basically gathers all of the change requests into the root zone. IANA, or the NTIA organization, authorizes those, and then Verisign produces those. And it's a nice separation between the politics and the operational aspects of that process. And we believe that that should continue. And I'm sure Milton is going to talk a little bit about one of his proposals about a structurally separated organization, which allows for the TLD operators to basically manage themselves in terms of this technical function, so that policy does not affect the operations. We believe that any future structure that allows the ability to trade security and stability for a political ambition, whether it be that or revenue, is a bad place to be. So I understand that ICANN is in a tough spot. They're in a tough spot today. They're trying to implement a program that's been going on for 6 years with the new generic top level domain, and so their history is that they have some pressures. They get pressures from everybody. It's a role that they can't please everybody all at one time. So I don't want to put them in a position to where they have to trade what they need to do for the community with security and stability. So lastly, when we talk about external accountabilities, today there's four, I see it as four accountability mechanisms that ICANN has in terms of the process. And if we talk about moving it to ICANN, there is the Affirmation of Commitments between the U.S. government and ICANN. There is the IANA contract between the U.S. government and ICANN. There is the ICANN board, as well as ICANN policies and procedures that exist today. With the announcement that the NTIA is stepping out of their role, that the U.S. government oversight goes away, or the stewardship goes away when it comes to the IANA function, which I can only presume that the Affirmation of Commitments in its current format will go away, because essentially ICANN has the ability to leave that 120 days after notification to the U.S. government that they're leaving. And I don't know what a replacement mechanism would look like. But what that leaves is two internal accountable organizations, the ICANN board and ICANN policy. And we believe that there needs to be an external accountable replacement. And whether that means the board as it is today, because the ICANN policy process is how the board is put together. And so maybe there's a function that needs to change around the ICANN board and how it's developed today. And then some external accountability through an auditor general type approach. So those are the risks that we focus on, and we think they all lead back to security and stability in terms of what Verisign is concerned about at the end of the day. Thank you. Did I make 10 minutes?
Yeah, you're great. You were 5.
Great.
Wow, that's awesome. You didn't even need Fiona's time. Richard?
Hello, my name is Richard Jimmerson. I'm with the American Registry for Internet Numbers. I'd also like to thank the Washington, D.C. chapter of the Internet Society for holding this event today. I'd like to thank George Washington University for being the venue for the event. It's a very important conversation that we're having here. Now, what I'm going to focus on primarily is the first question. I want to give a description of one of the customers of the IANA Functions as performed by ICANN. So, ARIN is a regional internet registry. We're a nonprofit organization. What we do is we administer the blocks of IP address space and autonomous system numbers in North America and portions of the Caribbean. That's IPv4 address space, IPv6 address space, autonomous system numbers. Another thing that we do that's related to this conversation is we manage for that region reverse DNS, inverse mapping. We put together the zone files for that and work together with the other regional internet registries, and we provide that information to the IANA so that it can be moved to the root zone and that can be updated on a daily basis, of course. So, RAR system, there are 5 nonprofit regional internet registries across the globe. There's basically one per major continental area, and all that we do is manage the distribution of internet number resources in those regions. And ARIN is one of the 5. ARIN started its operations in December of 1997. It is a nonprofit organization that started off in a transition from Network Solutions. There was an IP group inside Network Solutions that was managing the distribution of all of the internet number resources. And the decision was made back then when it was decided that the domain name industry was going to become competitive, that the IP address space administration was something that they did not want to be managed competitively. They thought it was too finite a resource, and they created this nonprofit organization to manage that resource. Predating ARIN inception is also it was the RIPEN CC back in 1992 and APNIC in 1993. After ARIN's inception, the 4th and the 5th regional internet registries were formed. First LACNIC in the early 2000s, and shortly followed by AFRINIC to manage all resource administration for the continent of Africa. So in the ARIN community, the ARIN staff, the ARIN secretariat staff, it's a small organization. There's 58 of us inside the organization. We have a very defined role. We're managing the distribution of the internet number resources. And we have a community, a policy community that actually creates the rules, that creates the internet resource distribution policies that we execute as the registry on a daily basis. One of the most important things that we do for the community is we ensure the uniqueness of the IP addresses and the autonomous system numbers in these series of databases across the 5 regional internet registries to ensure that not more than one organization is authoritative over a single range of IP addresses or an autonomous system number. That's very important for the internet. And we serve that information up in WHOIS and in other ways for people to determine who has authority over certain ranges of addresses. We are a customer of the IANA Functions, and we've been working with ICANN for many years. When each of the regional internet registries requires a new block of IP address space, be it IPv4, autonomous or IPv6 or an autonomous system number block, we go to the IANA and we make our request to the IANA for an additional block. And they issue that block down to the regional internet registries. We each, when one of us receives a block of number resources, cross-check the blocks that we receive from them to make sure there are no conflicts or anything along those lines. So we are a direct customer of the IANA Functions. The path down to us with the IP addresses, protocols are created at the IETF. The IETF, through IANA considerations or other means or specific RFCs that are meant to do this, will actually pass down or delegate the ability for an organization to manage a resource for the IETF. And they've done that with IP address space. So from the IETF, they've delegated down to the IANA, and then the IANA has instructions to issue IP address space blocks down to the regional internet registries. Then each of us, we distribute those internet number resources according to the policies that are set by our communities out to all of the internet service providers and enterprise organizations around the world that require the use of them. There are several resources that you can find that describe these. One of the more recent ones is an RFC, request for comment, out of the IETF 7020 that describes this relationship. I'm with ARIN, American Registry for Internet Numbers. We're a customer of the IANA Functions, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you have about how that currently works today or how it's worked in the past as we move forward in the conversation this morning.
Great, Richard. Thank you. That was like 5 minutes and 14 seconds, which is amazing. Yes, you guys must really be fearful that I'm going to like have a hammer and hit you if you go over time. So, and our next speaker is Steve DelBianco, and also I forgot to mention, and Fiona usually mentions this at the beginning, that this is a fun-filled world of acronyms, and that's directly quoting from Fiona. It's an alphabet soup of acronyms, and if you don't understand something, either in the room or on Twitter, just ask, what the heck does that particular acronym mean, and we'll try to answer it for you. Steve?
Yeah, if Tim has a hammer, I'm glad Milton and I are a long way down the end of the table, because it'll be very hard for us to cover in 10 minutes, but we'll do our best. I express my appreciation to ISOC and George Washington University. And let's get right to the first question. What are the IANA functions? Well, you've heard so far, it's mostly clerical. There's really nothing to it. So what it is about the IANA functions that make it so important that we're holding an event on it on a rainy morning in Washington? And I think that the answer to that comes from paraphrasing Milton Mueller's book from a decade ago. Who rules the root? Well, who rules the root calls the tune. Because the operator of IANA maintains the root zone, as Pat told you, and that gives them the authority to admit new top-level domains and to discipline or maybe even redelegate existing top-level domains. So ICANN, the organization, as opposed to ICANN, the community, ICANN, the organization, definitely wants the IANA functions, including root zone maintainer. The IANA contract, therefore, really has tremendous symbolic power beyond its mere technical functions. Just witnessed in 2012 when NTIA, Fiona's department, said, ICANN, we're putting up the IANA contract for bid, and as far as we're concerned, your response doesn't measure up. You didn't really answer the requirements we had to be the IANA functions operator, so they canceled the contract. ICANN redid its bid, paid more attention, was duly disciplined, and it got the contract in late 2012. But that was a shining example of where NTIA was able to use the contract discipline. So my answer to the first question is that the IANA contract functions as an accountability mechanism for IANA. So let me go to the second question. What led to the U.S. decision? Fiona noted that it was always the expectation. Well, not exactly. It was, in fact, the Clinton administration's expectation in 1998, for sure. But when the UN called a meeting about internet governance, the famous Tunis meeting in 2005, the Bush administration issued the new principles on the DNS. Quote, the U.S. will maintain its historic role in authorizing changes or modifications to the authoritative root zone. And Congress unanimously approved a few months later HCON Res 268, worked on by Mr. Steve Miller, one of our hosts today. and I'll quote the key line, it says that the authoritative root zone server should remain physically located in the United States, and the Secretary of Commerce should maintain oversight of ICANN. So in our system, the last law in wins, right? So it wasn't always planned to transition. But in any event, these 2005 proclamations really inflamed the BRIC countries and many other governments and empowered them to complain even louder that the U.S. had unilateral control of critical internet resources. So it definitely had the effect of inflaming the opposition to the U.S. position. The optics were terrible, and it generated an awful lot of pressure for equality among governments. NTIA took a huge step in 2009, and great kudos to Fiona for writing the Affirmation of Commitments, which ended the U.S. formal oversight of the transition of ICANN. And with that track record in hand and the moral authority of the U.S. for free expression and innovation, I fondly remember Secretary Larry Strickling lecturing the Kenya Internet Governance Forum on how the governments in that room really had no business getting in the way of innovation or trying to stop on free expression. Those were the heady days, and I wish we were still there. Then came Snowden. Was Snowden a catalyst or merely just a convenient excuse? Either way, Snowden's revelations reduced the U.S. moral authority on internet governance. At NetMundial, one of my favorite quotes last week was the bravery and courage of whistleblower Edward Snowden, because without him, we would not be having this discussion. It was said by no fewer than 4 people. And the transcripts from NetMundial show the word surveillance was cited 104 times in the discussion. Didn't make it into the final document, though. So the perfect storm that was brewing was Snowden's wind blowing the U.S. government into the Sao Paulo meeting and then on to Istanbul for the IGF and then Busan, Korea for the ITU Plenipot. And the UN in New York, of course, is ready at any time to take on a new resolution. So I understand why the administration decided to start the transition before NetMundial. The politics and optics make sense. They did it with sound principles, but Commerce decided to do it with minimal guidance and a real hands-off involvement. I would have preferred a more directed transition. For example, the affirmation was a negotiated document between NTIA and ICANN. How would it have turned out if the affirmation was crafted from a global multi-stakeholder bottom-up process? It might have been fine. But I have to suggest that there are some risks involved in that. And that brings me to our third question, the risks and opportunities associated with this big change. 2 risks to talk about. The first is an event risk. Event risk would be, what if the replacement for IANA and ICANN accountability mechanisms doesn't meet NTIA's prescribed conditions? The risk is that NTIA would reject the transition then and extend IANA for another 2 years. Well, despite claims at Congress last month that NTIA and ICANN say, we can take our time, we can get this right, we only have 1 shot, we can hear an extension of 2 years, even 2 times. Frankly, you can already hear the howling from global governments if the U.S. flunks the transition plan and extends the transition. The outcome document was full of adherents in NetMundial who wanted to make that a hard stop deadline of September 2015. And I think that folks are believing that it's a deadline, even if we don't want to acknowledge it. The second risk I'll call is systemic risk. And this stems from the fact that we have to see ICANN as 2 things. ICANN is an organization, ICANN Incorporated, but it's also a word we use to refer to this multi-stakeholder community of registrants and users and registries and registrars on the internet. In Larry Strickling's letter to Senator Rubio just last week, he named this risk himself at the end of page 2, where NTIA says that the ISTAR organizations are enlisted to act as a check on the, quote, remote possibility that ICANN could act to increase its autonomy and reduce its accountability, quote. Well, calling that a remote possibility is a bit of an understatement. Why? Because it's in our nature. It's in your nature if you're an organization man to protect your organization. Protect it from lawsuits, external scrutiny, secure long-term funding streams, and maybe expand over time. So as noted in my Circle ID post last night, we have an opportunity to check those organizational instincts. ICANN announced last week at NetMundial a parallel interdependent process to reset ICANN's accountability mechanisms. Now, accountability of ICANN, not IANA. So finally, we're acknowledging this notion that the IANA contract is a discipline and symbolic accountability mechanism for ICANN, so we need to talk about them both together. So accountable means you're accountable for something to someone. The something that ICANN's accountable for, well, it's the Affirmation of Commitments. Very popular with members of the ICANN community, maybe not so popular with ICANN Incorporated's management team. The someone to whom you're accountable, well, for better or worse, right now it's NTIA. They're the only ones who are the signers of the Affirmation of Commitments. But the good news is the rest of the world has jumped in with both feet to join the review teams that the affirmation calls for. The question is, after the transition, to whom would ICANN be accountable? Now, Milton Mueller has written very thoughtfully about this concept of structural separation between the technical and policy aspects of the IANA function. Pat Kane echoed it as well. I think you guys are on to something here, but I'm eager to understand how IANA structural separation alone would really hold ICANN accountable to the Affirmation of Commitments. How would it hold ICANN accountable to its limited technical mission and keep it from expanding scope? Now, one way to assess risks like that would be to confront this post-transition IANA and ICANN mechanisms to stress test scenarios. And I described these in my congressional testimony earlier this month. Chairman Walden embraced the idea. I've even heard Secretary Strickling and Fadi understand that this might be a way forward to channel concerns that one has about the undefined transition. And instead of asking it all to stop while you predefine things, why not proceed with the planning of a transition? But let's assess the transition against certain stress test or scenarios. So just give you a quick example. Russia's got a new law. They just passed earlier this week about bloggers, and it requires that any blogger with more than 3,000 page views a day on a website has to be in person with the Russian government. So what if, here's a scenario, what if governments at the GAC insisted that new top-level domain operators have to follow all applicable laws, especially in regulated industries or sensitive sectors? So does the Russian law mean that any blog visible in Russia with over 3,000 views a day, that every blogger has to register with the Russian government? That doesn't seem to make any sense. And how would the Government Advisory Committee, or GAC, approve such a thing under consensus? Almost done, Tim. The hammer's coming. Last paragraph. So you would well imagine that the U.S. government, among others, would veto this notion of the GAC bringing the Russian blogger law in because it could be used to, well, discipline the .blog top-level domain. But listen, the GAC itself only operates on consensus because it feels like it. The GAC can change from consensus to simple majority voting, the way they do it at the UN and the ITU. They can do that themselves. They're the ones who make their own voting rules. So the stress test becomes, what if the GAC moves into the direction of majority voting? What will our new accountability mechanisms do to stand in the way of a majority of governments driving the internet away from free expression and open innovation? So I'll stop there, Tim, and suggest that the biggest opportunity we have is probably not going to placate other governments who want a greater role. That's probably not going to happen as a result of this transition. But the main opportunity for us is to manage the risks so that we can keep growing an open internet.
All right. So you expended your time and then took a minute or two. Milton?
Thank you, Tim. And again, thanks very much to DC Internet Society and to Susan at the George Washington University for inviting me and bringing me in here. This is an issue that's dear to my heart. I've been writing about it for a long time. And let's begin with the most simple question. What is the IANA function? You've heard about the 3 or 4 different aspects of that. The point I want to emphasize here is that the real battle is over the DNS function. The other stuff really is not that much in play, in part because certainly with the protocol parameters, there's a very effective and clear accountability mechanism. The IETF can decide that IANA is not their implementer anymore, and they can shift that function to somebody else. So you have a choice function. With the DNS root, you do not have that. You cannot decide, oh, I think we'll have another DNS root tomorrow. Well, maybe somebody could do that. Maybe Google could try it, and maybe Verisign could try it. Although John Postel tried it a few years ago and got into a lot of trouble, and I suspect anybody trying it today would get into even more trouble. So DNS is where the money is right now, and that's where the policy battles are, and that's why we're having this conversation. Now, there are some interesting questions about the address registry, and in our discussions, we've chosen to defer those. Not that we couldn't be having them now, but the IANA transition, you can't try to do too much with it. So you could try to do things with the address function. You could say, let's implement a registry registrar split of the sort that we have in the DNS in the addressing space. And you could use the leverage of the IANA contract to try to bring that about. But that raises so many complicated issues that we haven't discussed that it really doesn't make sense to bring those kinds of things into the picture right now. So fundamentally, we're talking about what are we going to do with the DNS root? Do you agree?
Who rules the root?
Who rules the root? So most of my comments are going to, hey Derek, are going to talk about the risks and the opportunities. First of all, let's talk about the opportunities. Put differently, what is the risk of not doing this? I don't think people in the United States sufficiently appreciate that. Okay? What if we don't do this? Now, first of all, we're hypocrites. We're saying, keep government out of the internet. Let's not have governments controlling what happens on the internet. And oh, by the way, we're over here in control of something as a government, right? You know, that plays in Washington. It plays with patriotic Americans who think that we're exceptional. But to the rest of the world, we're just a government. We're a big, powerful government that a lot of them resent. So it doesn't make any sense for us to preach multi-stakeholderism and non-governmental governance of the internet, and at the same time have our hand in there in a very visible and powerful way. Furthermore, this generates political conflict, which I think Steve alluded to very accurately. Many people see the whole multi-stakeholder model as nothing more than a fig leaf for U.S. hegemony. And they call for equality among governments because there's a government in there again. So their idea is, well, if there's one government in there, then all the other sovereigns are legally equal as sovereigns. Why can't they be in there? So the risk of not doing this is that we really increase cynicism about internet governance and the U.S. role. We undermine our moral authority, and we encourage other governments to try to get involved. Now, what is the risk, once we've set this in play, what is the risk that some evil person will take it over? And I view this risk as being extremely small. I praise the Commerce Department for setting conditions on the transfer, that it would not go to an intergovernmental organization, that it would not go to a government-led solution. Some people, some very small voices at NetMundial challenged those conditions. They went nowhere. Nobody backed them up. So the risk of somehow the ITU or Russia swooping in and somehow gaining control of the IANA seems to me to be very small. However, if we don't have structural separation, it's bigger, and I'll get to that. The biggest risk is the risk of an unaccountable ICANN. I mean, we've made this clear from what we've heard about the IANA function so far, is that it's fundamentally an accountability function. It is not about them reviewing the changes and approving them. It is fundamentally about them writing the contract, saying what the IANA functions are and how they're done, and awarding or taking away the contract. That's what fundamentally the NTIA does. That's what's going to change. And fundamentally, that is a political oversight and accountability function. Some of the things we tend to, again, forget here in the US is that the NTIA could put anything into that contract. Every 3 years, they can rewrite it. They could put into there that, as I said jokingly, that everybody in ICANN has to wear their underpants on the outside of their pants. I don't know why they would do that. I'm not saying they would do that, but the point is we don't know what's going to go into that contract, and neither does the rest of the world. So that's a very important form of power over the DNS. So the risk of an unaccountable ICANN is twofold. Number one, ICANN is the convener of the process and has an interest in the outcome of the process. It's a bit of a problem with the NTIA plan. They did not say in their plan that IANA would be transitioned to ICANN. They said it would be transitioned to the global multi-stakeholder community. So we took that as being an open invitation to come up with ideas about how this transition should take place, and we believe that it should be an open debate regarding what the solution is. And we don't think that the convener of the process should have a major role in dictating the outcome. They are a logical choice to convene the process in some ways. Now, ICANN has responded to these criticisms by suddenly announcing an accountability track that would supplement the IANA transition track. And I'm still a little bit nervous about this. Steve has a quote here from Fadi Chahade. He says, "They will run in parallel, but they will inform each other." My answer to that is, they bloody well better. It says they are interdependent, they're interrelated, and if we are successful, we should get these processes to work on the same timeline. I'm going to say no if there, okay? You can't give ICANN IANA without knowing what makes them accountable first, okay? Get your priorities and your sequence correct here. Another risk of poor operational security or stability. You know, one of the reasons the IGP proposed to put the IANA functions in the hands of a registry consortium is because whose data is it anyway? What goes into the root? It's data about top-level domain registries. The root zone changes are demanded by registries, TLD registries, and the addition of new information is about new TLD registries. So who has the strongest incentive to get that information right, to keep it secure, to make sure it isn't messed up? It seems to me that the registries are the people there that should be somehow directly involved in this, not necessarily a third party, and not necessarily some diffuse multi-stakeholder committee. And so that's one of my final risks, which is the risk of a consensual but lousy solution. You know, something that everybody can agree on politically, but just doesn't work, just doesn't, you know, operationally translate into the real world. So how much time do I have left?
You have 1 minute.
1 minute and 15 seconds. So let me just finally plug the Internet Governance Project thought about this. And we came up with a proposal even before we knew that the NTIA was going to be transitioning this. And let me just say, one of the main motives of this idea of structural separation was that we kept running into people, particularly on the government side, who said, well, gee, suppose you want to add a new TLD, but a bunch of governments really object to it on policy grounds. We want to be able to put our fingers in there and veto what goes into the root. And this is how we came up with this idea of separating the policy realm from the operational realm. It's first, just get your act together, all right? Work out what the policy is, what you're going to put into the root, what's allowable, what isn't allowable, and then you give it to the operational side. You don't create a mechanism by which governments or anybody else can circumvent the process that we've gone through, maybe 3-year, 4-year process of deciding on a policy, and then somebody can come in at the last minute and circumvent it. That's just a terrible design of an institution. Now, one final point.
The hammer is.
Pay
Okay.
no attention to the man with the hammer.
I will. I want to explain to Steve.
I knew it was going to happen.
I want to explain to Steve this. I'm just too far away, aren't I? This will take about 15 seconds. So how does separation of IANA help with the accountability? First of all, it deconcentrates the power, and that's about all it does. We argued very explicitly in our paper that the accountability of ICANN is a long-term process that involves issues like membership, possibly new legal instruments, and possibly major structural changes within ICANN, particularly regarding the GNSO, and that those things will take years to work out. I can't see them taking place in less than 5 or 10 years. So that in the short term, if we're just talking about the IANA transition, we need to have an arrangement that deconcentrates power, that helps with accountability, but no, it doesn't solve everything.
All right, great. Milton and Steve are out of the first round of this particular game. You've exhausted the balance of your time. Fiona has a whopping 7 minutes left. Pat has 5 minutes, and Richard has 4 minutes and 45 seconds. I also, at this juncture, as we get deeper into this, I think we should also be mindful of the fact that the next panel that's going to be moderated by Roger Crescetti in the back there is looking at kind of possible scenarios of the future of IANA Functions. So we don't want to steal too much thunder from that particular panel. So let's try to make sure we stay to the questions at our charge. I've also been asked to kind of summarize this particular first round. Then I'll go back and you guys can use the remainder of your time. And we don't need to do this like dominoes, like rolling down and rolling back. You can just jump in whenever. But I think it's worth noting that there's Fiona laid out a really good process on why she felt like this is the right time to do that. ICANN has become more robust, more accountable, and this is the right time. It's a process that's going on for a long time. Really interesting. I think it's interesting that she didn't know until we got to Steve. No one mentioned the NSA. No one mentioned the ITU. No one mentioned kind of the growing concern internationally about some of these issues. Pat it identified risks as far as he was concerned as security and stability, which are not insignificant at all. They are hugely important. We are creating this global network of exponentially growing internet services that require the stability and security of this really important resource. And so Pat's risks, he kind of pointed to those risks as well. Richard was talking about the allocation and the stewardship of IPv6 and IPv4 and how they kind of make sure that operates properly. Also has a very important function in security as well. Steve laid out a lot of different issues, including the concept that the horse, don't let the horse out of the barn, so to speak. I think that was probably one of, you don't think he used that expression, but once it's gone, it's kind of hard to get back. Milton kind of echoed those sentiments that if we let this go and we don't have a good process in place, that'll be really hard to wrest back control. And then I think Pat and Milton also agreed on structural separation. And so I think that's where we are. Let me just kind of allow the folks with remaining time to go rebut, and then I'll go to some questions, and I have a few questions of my own. Anybody want to rebut or comment? Fiona, 7 minutes.
You always have to save the time for the more interesting part of the conversation, a little bit of planning ahead. Anyway, thanks you guys. Always good information. And as always, I like to thank Steve and Milton for always making my job sound more intriguing and cloak and dagger than it has been over the years. Always makes me a little more entertained about what we do. But just to maybe clear up some of the misconceptions and some of the facts, what we've actually done is clearly, with our announcement, is put on the table the willingness of the U.S. government to step out of its role. And we've defined our role very limited in terms of the IANA functions. To Steve's point, yes, there is an accountability process associated with that. The IANA contract is not a disciplining tool in and of itself, but we do recognize that there is the perception and there are these real needs to deal with these ICANN accountability issues. I would point out that my recollection of the meeting in Singapore is there were 2 sessions in Singapore. The morning session was on the IANA transition, and the afternoon session was on accountability. So I'm unclear why people are surprised with statements last week in Brazil that there's going to be a second process as well. So I'll leave that to you guys to eventually respond. But from my perspective, there were the 2 sessions in Singapore, and this was always clearly articulated, maybe not as detailed as it is coming out. So maybe I'll just leave it at that and save my time for more interest.
Richard, Pat?
Sure, I'll go. I'll just add a bit here. Listening to everyone speak, one of the things that occurred to me was that I focused on the first question. So I want to add a little bit about the last question there. What are the risks and opportunities associated with this fundamental change? I just want to talk a little bit about the opportunities. There are many people in this room that have spent lots of their time over the past 10 or 20 years encouraging other people to become involved in this, become more aware, become more involved, and to join the discussion. And it's not been an easy process. There just aren't as many people paying attention, or there hasn't been as many people paying attention over the years that should have been. And people inside the conversation. And one of the things that I really do see as an opportunity with the recent events is that there are many more people paying attention, and there are many more people joining the conversation, and I think that's a very positive thing.
So I just want to make comment a little bit about what Steve said. Steve talked about this being a clerical function. And I think if you take a look at what ICANN has done from a scoping document, if it's a clerical function, they focus really on the authorization role or the authorizing role that NTIA performs today. And I think that when we take a look at NTIA stepping out of that role, it really is still more than a clerical function because NTIA is outsourced to Verisign and to ICANN certain functions of what goes on within the root zone maintenance process. And they're responsible for what we do every day. So they've chosen to outsource that process to Verisign and ICANN, but they are accountable at the end of the day for what we do because we're performing based upon the cooperative agreement between Verisign and NTIA and the contract for the IANA function between ICANN. So I think it's really more than a clerical function, Steve, because they're responsible for what we do or what we fail to do. Okay. And the second thing I wanted to talk about was also Steve talked about it. Steve talked about the GAC changing, the Government Advisory Committee kind of changing what how they go about making a decision from consensus to a voting model. And consensus, as I understand today, and Fiona, you may have to correct me on this one, consensus can be achieved by no governments making any objections. So it may be a position that 2 out of 100 and some odd governments have, but if nobody objects, that defines consensus. And so over time, one of the things with an unaccountable with an externally unaccountable entity, definitions can change. We're seeing the definition of the multi-stakeholder model change today. I mean, multi-stakeholder model used to mean bottom-up, community-driven discussions, whereas now you could take a look at what the multi-stakeholder model has become within ICANN, and it has turned into a 42-day public consultation period. And they're very, very different mechanisms. And so over time, we may see things change, but we will see definitions change. I mean, governments change definitions all the time to suit the needs of what's going on within the government at the time. That will continue to happen.
So Fiona and Pat and Richard still have some time left. You're a embarrassment of riches as far as time goes.
Yeah, so
you can yield the remainder of your time to other less fortunate people down at the end of the table.
that'd be a little bit too easy. So I think also maybe for those that haven't followed this as closely, and I think we probably failed to do this by jumping straight into the questions, what did we actually do at NTIA? We issued an announcement saying it was our intent to transition the role that we have to the global multi-stakeholder community and to stewardship of these functions. In doing so, we laid out 4 key conditions. Those were the transition proposal has to support and enhance the multi-stakeholder model. It needs to maintain the stability, security, and resiliency of the DNS. It needs to meet the needs and expectations of the IANA customers and partners, and it needs to maintain the openness of the internet. And as I think Steve had mentioned earlier, we also made clear that we would not accept an intergovernmental or government-led solution. And so in doing so, it wasn't like we just said, okay, we're leaving, here you go. We said, here, okay, it's time for us to leave the role that we currently have. By the way, we're not leaving ICANN. We'll still be very active participants in the GAC and do the things that we do. But we said it's time for us to leave this, role we have with respect to the IANA functions. We asked ICANN to convene stakeholders working with the other affected parties and ISOC and others and come back with a proposal. We laid the 4 corners of what we were looking for, and we're asking the people more directly affected in these efforts to come up with what makes sense. That's what we've done. So the idea that we sort of are stepping away, it was irresponsible, I think I would take issue with a little bit, and I think some of that came across a little bit on that end of the table. So, just to be clear, we also said, look, the current contract has an expiration date of September 30th, 2015. However, that contract has 2 2-year extensions. So we're not even halfway through the first term of the contract. We've gone to the community and said, look, there's more than half the term left in this. What do you all think would work? Come back to us with a proposal that makes sense, that enjoys broad community support, and then we can consider what to do and how to move forward. If, however, it takes longer than a year and a half, which is September next year, we have the option to extend. So we're not walking off a cliff. We have a lot of time to get this done the right way. That's what we've done.
So why don't I be magnanimous and allow Milton and Steve like 30 seconds each.
30 seconds.
Yeah.
Think about stress testing. Their policy board said we're going to launch these. Then structure separate. So it takes engages. It's like .home. It's like years of recommendations.
Steve, is your mic on?
That they would cause collisions. So at the last minute, the policy said corp and home were fine, but if the reality showed they were dangerous, I would have wanted the entity that runs the IANA function, the root zone maintainer, to be able to say, timeout. I know your policy granted corp and home, .corp.home, but let's take a timeout and examine whether we have to be more careful. We would want to ask whether the replacement mechanism for the current mechanism would preserve that authority through structural separation or what other means to be able to intervene and stop something from going to the root if it endangered security, stability, and resiliency.
Yes, just addressing Fiona's comments. I'm still unclear what the NTIA means when it says we're only talking about turning over our functions as NTIA, our stewardship functions, to the community, if that does not also mean a full review of the way ICANN is held accountable by the NTIA, by its ability to award or not award the contract, by its ability to draft the contract. I just don't understand what is in play if we're not talking about that. And I would say the accountability track that was announced in Singapore was not called an accountability a track. It was called a track about the affirmation of commitments, the future of the affirmation of commitments. And since those of us who are hardcore accountability advocates tend to be sitting on this side of the table, do not consider the affirmation of commitments to be a serious form of external accountability, we did not take very much interest in that discussion. Now, it seems that that error has been corrected, that the discussion of accountability has been broadened, and it has been linked, albeit tenuously, too tenuously, to the IANA transition. So we're making progress here, but it still makes me nervous, this big if in Fadi's statement.
Okay, Fiona, you still have time. Let me just ask other people. Do people feel like the affirmation of commitments is not a sufficient accountability mechanism? Steve, you have another 15 seconds.
Let's assume that it is sufficient. The problem is that ICANN can cancel it. They can walk away from the affirmation with 120 days notice, and a year after the ink was dry on the affirmation, then chairman of ICANN said he considered it a temporary document that would be terminated before long. That's not the current chairman, that's not the current management, and they may feel differently. But a future chairman, a future ICANN board can walk away from the affirmation with 120 days notice. That makes it, well, accountable until it isn't.
Pat, you still have another minute and a half at least.
So I think that Steve points out some really good points, and Fadi Shahadi, the president and CEO of ICANN, has indicated that there would be an affirmation of commitments with some other organization. He's basically talked about having an affirmation of commitment to the world. What does that mean? Who is that affirmation of commitment to? Who sits down and signs that new AOC between ICANN and some other organization? I mean, that's a question that I would have going forward. So they've committed to the U.S. government, NTIA specifically, that they will review their processes, review the outcomes of certain things like the new GTLD program, review their accountability and transparency, and they are required to do so within that agreement. When they leave, who do they then have that commitment with? When Fadi talks about the world, is that an internal process? Is that an external process? And I think that's where we have to take a look at what that follow-on commitment looks like.
Richard, any views on that? All right, Fiona, so
I think it's also important to keep in mind what the affirmation of commitments actually contain. So my reading of the affirmation, and Milton may correct me if I'm wrong, I'm assuming, is that most of the things that ICANN commits to in the affirmation of commitments are contained in some fashion in their bylaws. Now, that being said, people can change bylaws as well. Well, if you let me finish, how about that? So you've got that part. Then there's what the Department of Commerce commits to do in terms of participating in ICANN. And then there's the operative point, which is the multi-stakeholder reviews. So, I do think there's the question of how do you make sure all of that continues. And I think Steve's offered a great idea with stress tests. We've endorsed that, so that's a great thing for this process to do, not just on this, but on a couple of the other things that come up in the conversation here today. So again, we're looking at, two processes, and I won't bother to try to quote Fadi directly. I don't have the words in front of me in terms of how he described it in Brazil last week, interrelated, interdependent, whatever the words were. But one looking at what replaces the NTIA role with respect to what we've described as a clerical function in the IANA Functions contract, or the IANA Functions system, and then what replaces, the symbolic but accountability role that people think we've had, and what does this community want to replace that? So I think we're looking at two related processes that are going to be, unfolding over the next year and a half.
All right, let me go to the next round. Thank you for all abiding by the 10-minute rule. I really appreciate it. I'm sorry for being such a dictator in that regard. So the next round is me asking a question, then I'm going to go to questions from the audience in just 1 second. I think there was a discussion about the structural separation issue, which I kind of hear a lot. Milton spoke about it. I think Pat also mentioned structural separation. What do people think about why not having structural separation? Wouldn't that divorce and those functions, those policy functions from ICANN, and it might be a blessing to ICANN?
So I think that the current contract includes a requirement for separation of policy and operational activities based on what the customers had wanted in the last renewal of the contract, and we would expect that to continue in some fashion if that's what folks want. I think the idea of structurally separating, and I'm not quite sure what folks mean by that, because structural separation, functional separation, these are traditional sort of, from my perspective, telecom structures and terms. So I'm not 100% sure what's envisioned when people say that. But again, what we've put on the table is removing our role. We have not called into question ICANN's performance of the IANA functions, or honestly, Verisign's performance of the root zone maintainer. We have not taken a position on whether Verisign should stay or go. I think that the community can have that conversation. But what we've said is we're removing our role. And, to put this in perspective again, when we started the privatization process in 96, 97, and we went through with the green paper and the white paper, and ICANN was created by stakeholders, with the idea of competition and consumer choice in the domain namespace, the provision of the IANA Functions contract and having ICANN do that was to smooth that transition. So I think from our perspective, that decision was made in 1998.
So I think that when you take a look at how the role works today, and in our role as we participate in signing the root zone, one of the things that we've done the last year is we've been very vocal on this name collision issue. It's been something we've spent a lot of time on, and there was question at one point in time as to whether or not Verisign would actually do our job in terms of making modifications to the root zone. It was a conversation that we had with the NTIA. The letters are publicly available, but we went through a process and we basically said, yes, we will do our job. I think the structural separation opportunity becomes, is there a way to make certain that whatever the follow-on organization looks like and the accountability mechanisms look like can say, here's the things that we've determined from a policy standpoint, but do they make sense from a security and stability standpoint? Do they make sense moving forward? Because we don't want to disrupt this fundamental root zone that directs traffic on the internet today. It's become such an economic force around the globe, not just here in the U.S., but we want to make certain that we do that in a secure and stable manner. And so I think that there's questions come up around that. And I'm not saying that anything that was negative in that process. It was a good process, had a good outcome. So,
all right.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that I think matters like this deserve conversation. I think it's great that the communities are having conversations like this. And I'm confident if there is broad discussion about this with all of the right people at the table participating, with everyone that has an opportunity to participate, that we'll come up with the right course forward. But the thing that I'd like to stress is that whatever we do, stability is paramount. We need to make sure that the core infrastructures that we're talking about here remain stable as we move through any sort of transition. But I think it's a very positive thing that the conversations are happening.
So we'll go into the next round with the questions from, Steve, you wanted, okay.
It was about structural separation, and I'm intrigued by the idea. I have to wait for NetChoice members to weigh in on whether we want to embrace it. But I believe the only way you can assess it is by applying these stress tests to something like a structurally separated post-US transition. I'll give you an example. Policy would allow singulars and plurals of the same top-level domain. So .hotel goes into the root in January, and then come July, .hotels is about to enter the root. Policy says that's fine. But hang on, there's a lawsuit hanging in the air in Europe and the United States, an injunction trying to stop the operator of IANA from putting in a plural version of a singular top-level domain that's already in there. They might be arbitrary and capricious. It might be that they're claiming that it's an intellectual property problem. But the point is, what will this structurally separate entity do faced with a court injunction? maybe even one that's valid in the country where that entity has a legal presence. So let's do these stress tests and ask whether separate or integrated, whether the structure of IANA is going to be able to react to real world problems.
All right, Milton, if you can let me, I really need to get to questions. I mean, maybe we can get back to the structural separation question a bit later. For questions, if you could just identify yourself, and if you asked a question on Twitter, you can just re-ask it. I'm sorry I didn't get to it. Please ask a question, not a comment in lieu of a question. And then for the panelists, you don't need to answer them. Or you don't feel, not all the panelists need to answer every single question. If you don't have a passionate response, don't offer one. All right, first question.
Hi, my name is Joe Hall from CDT. So we've seen the U.S. government use the DNS in strange ways. For example, redirecting various websites for whatever reason. They haven't used the root zone to do this. They've used legal instruments to registries. My question is, what keeps them from doing that? Is it the affirmations? Is it just the chaos that would result from tinkering with the root zone? And what would exist to keep that from happening in, say, there's an entity that takes over the IANA functions that is not a U.S. jurisdiction or whatever, or you know, I mean, it could be anything, right? And I just don't know what that is. And so maybe, hopefully that makes sense.
And it's worth noting that ICANN is incorporated in California as its jurisdiction.
I mean, just maybe to answer the one question, what NTIA has done for the last 16 years in our role as sort of the steward of the system is to not intervene. A variety of people over the years, one in line soon, has asked us to intervene in different ways, and we've chosen not to. Instead, we've actually referred people to participate in the multi-stakeholder community. So our administration of the system has been very neutral and apolitical, and it's one of the criteria that we've laid out, that maintaining the openness of the internet, whatever happens once we leave, needs to make sure that continues.
So legally, what stops them from intervening is basically nothing. Politically, what stops them from intervening is that it would be kind of a disaster, and they would lose a lot of credibility. However, speaking of stress tests, I would remind you all of a certain three-letter top-level domain around about 2004 through 5, which generated 25,000 emails from religious right-wing groups, and it was a bit of an intervention there.
For those of you, I think it's referring to .xxx. Is that correct? Yeah. It's one thing like throwing out an acronym and not defining it. It's another thing just like intimating an acronym. But anyway, that's that aside.
It's not an acronym.
Oh, true. Sure. It depends on. Well, okay. We don't really want to debate that. Next question. We'll get it in order of lining up. We're going to go the gentleman first.
Okay. The degree of necessary accountability to some extent depends on the degree of trust in ICANN as an organization. I'd like to know whether the panelists believe that the secret board resolution enacted last September, which authorized the CEO to go to Montevideo and then on to Brasilia to request the Net Mundial meeting, whether the issuance of a very detailed plan for how the IANA transition discussion should proceed based on very perfunctory discussions in Singapore and accompanied by a scoping document, which is outrageously narrow, and the announcement yesterday that the discussion of these issues will take place on the last day of the London meeting rather than the first day and take away most of the public forum that's used for the community to engage with ICANN, whether these actions are the type of actions that engender trust in the organization.
Any takers?
Thank you, Phil. I believe that assessing the degree of trust that one has today doesn't help you very much at structuring permanent accountability mechanisms, because permanent accountability mechanisms should be there in case the ICANN you trust today is not trustworthy tomorrow. But you bring up a great point, is that we should examine the scenarios and the stresses that happened and ask whether the new accountability mechanisms would permit them to happen. And you bring up a great point with respect to the scoping document, which was trying to be very narrow about what could be discussed to constrain things. And we heard last week at Net Mundial, there was an effort to add structural separation. Milton and many other advocates of that went to the microphone and advocating putting structural separation into the transition part of the document. And ICANN management, not the community ICANN, but ICANN, the management group, said, no, we don't want to be inordinately prescriptive in the transition. So they took that out. So I would just say, Phil, that indicates we should say to ICANN, don't be inordinately prescriptive. When you do a scoping document on the transition, anything should be on the table. And we end up trying to hold them to a rule that they think is good in one body ought to be good in another place. But I don't think you can just look at degree of trust based on current behavior. You have to really look at scenarios and ask whether the mechanism would respond.
All right, this gentleman, then we'll go over there, and then there, then back.
Hi, I'm Peter Timish. Hi, Fiona. This question is just for you. It's short. In 2000, the GAO General Counsel asked a question to the Department of Commerce's General Counsel if it had legal authority to transfer control, the contract, right, or management, over to an authoritative root server to a private entity that would necessitate legislation. The department stated it had no current plans to transfer policy authority, authoritative root zone, to ICANN or anyone else, so it did not develop a scenario or set of circumstances which transfer of control would be done. Specifically, Andrew Pincus, Department of Commerce's General Counsel, advised in a letter on June 7, 2000, in the absence of such plans, we have not devoted the possibly substantial staff resources that would be necessary to develop a legal opinion as to whether legislation would be necessary to do so. In the absence of the underlying legal analysis, we decline to speculate about such an important issue. 2 questions. Now the department plans to transfer control of the authoritative root zone server to a private entity. Has its general counsel issued a legal opinion whether the Department of Commerce has the authority to do so, whether the legislation should be necessary? And if the general counsel has issued a legal opinion regarding this, can you please provide a copy as part of the community process?
Another question was Fiona, but my understanding is that I think we discussed in the beginning that the contract is expiring. This isn't necessarily a transfer.
It's the authority, not the contract. It's the authority to issue the contract. So the 2 parts is the GAO in 2000 wrote that the contract could be issued, but the authority to grant had to stay with the Department of Commerce. We're talking about the authority to actually transfer and issue the contract is the question.
I think it's more of an exploration, but we did a panel a couple of weeks ago for the Internet Caucus, and there's really about 5 or 6 minutes where the panelists discuss this issue at length. I'm not sure how much time we want to devote to this today, but I'll let
I'm happy to answer quickly. So I think the scope of the GAO study is slightly different from how you've described it as a starting point. But our assessment is that we're not transferring assets or property in any way whatsoever. We're simply letting a contract expire if that's the case. And any department of the United States government, any federal agency has the ability to determine it no longer needs to procure services. So that is our opinion on this.
Sir.
Hey, I'm Bill Cunningham. So I launched my first website November 16th, 1995. So I've actually been a long-time observer. 2 questions. What's the economic risk at play here? You talked about political and operational. Nobody talked about economics. Number 1, what does it cost to operate the DNS server on an annual basis globally? And number 2, what economic value is at risk if that goes down? Which leads into my second question, which is, what's the worst case scenario? All right, so you do this transfer and everything goes to hell in a handbasket. What exactly does that look like? Thanks.
So maybe I'll just start by saying the relationships and there's no money involved, so ICANN currently performs the IANA functions at no cost to the government contract. So there's no dollar value associated for us either of our relationships.
No. I'm asking a broader global question. You look at the internet globally. What does it cost to run the plumbing of the internet? And what is the economic value that is generated by the internet? Globally. Has anybody looked at those numbers? You guys are aware.
Well, I mean, Verisign certainly has expenses that we incur to operate the root zone as well as the .com and .net infrastructure. But from a global perspective as to what it costs to run all of that, it really depends upon each top-level domain, each name server operator, each hosting company. And so there's a lot of people that expend resources. Now, what is the economic value? I think if you take a look at what happens today with companies that are growing and generating billions of dollars of value to their shareholders. It's quite broad.
Right. Well, I'm an economist. I'm just trying to get to those two numbers. What does it
Well,
cost? And what is
I'm sure we can get those numbers. Those are probably substantial numbers, and I think if Milton wants to kind of weigh in on this, but I think this is something we can get offline, and I can put this on the Twitter hashtag and post that for you later.
Yeah, Pat started to cover it at the end. I think he was asking about the overall economic value of the DNS, which is vast. I mean, the industry itself is upwards of $5 billion, $6 billion a year in revenues, and that is I did my rough assessment several years ago, so that could be double. You know.
And maybe a data point here, just because we're on the topic, is ICANN's revenues over the years. That number is thrown about quite a bit. What is that?
ICANN's budget has gone from like 1 million a year to 60 million to 600 million, I think now. But a lot of that is one-off fees associated with new TLD applications.
Okay, it wasn't an answer to that question, but it was a relevant data point in this discussion. Ma'am?
Tim, I do have an answer to that question. We've done some research that the direct online revenue is about 200 billion a year in the United States and 1.5 trillion globally right now. But ICANN and IANA are only responsible for numbering resources, registrations, and resolutions. So what's the worst that can happen is that hundreds of companies like yours, Bill, who got new domains in a brand new top-level domain. You moved your bike shop to .bike, and then 10 months later, you've reprinted all your business cards. Your trucks now have your new domain name. It used to be billsbikes.com. Now it's bills.bike. And then something happens. That top-level domain fails. Maybe it's financial reasons, security reasons, censorship, who knows? But if it fails, you have financial impact. Your customers can't reach you the way they used to reach you, and you have to reprint T-shirts and trucks and go through that process. It's hard to measure what that damage would be, but that's what the worst that could happen would be at the level of a registrant like yourself.
Hi, I'm Judith Halcyon. I'm with ISOC-DC, and we've had a very active discussion on the remote participation, and we have had people from about 6 or 7 different countries. And we got a couple of questions, one for Richard, one for Fiona, and one for Milton. And a question for Richard is, does AT&T and Level 3 go through ARIN, and what does ARIN pay to ICANN for the IANA contract? And then we have a question to Milton on what's the difference between structural and functional separation, and how is that different from separation? And to Fiona, the question is, why do you think the U.S. government will walk away from its affirmation of commitments as part of the IANA transition? So I put all 3 questions down.
So I'll answer adding good figures. We're not planning on walking away from our commitment to ICANN through participating in the GAC or through the affirmation of commitment. So all we're talking about is walking away. Walking away is probably the wrong word, but transitioning the stewardship role that we have with respect to the IANA function. So we're not leaving ICANN. We'll be an active participant in the GAC. We'll be, an active participant in the affirmation of commitments and ICANN's accountability processes, and we'll continue to advocate, separate and apart from ICANN in broader internet governance regimes for a free and open internet. So that is what we're doing.
This is Richard from ARIN. I want to answer the question. Companies like they mentioned AT&T and Level 3, and the question was, do they go through ARIN? The answer is yes. Companies like AT&T and Level 3 do receive internet number resources through the regional internet registry ARIN. We ensure the uniqueness of their internet number resources in a database to ensure that other organizations can't use or try to route those addresses. We basically assert who's authoritative over those IP addresses and ensure the uniqueness. The other question was, does ARIN or the RIRs make any contribution to the IANA? And the question is yes, that the RIRs collectively do contribute dollars to ICANN for the IANA Functions operation. We do so on an annual basis, and across the 5 of us, we make a total contribution of $820,000 a year.
If I could answer the question. So functional versus structural separation, pretty easy. The difference is that with functional separation, the functions are in the same corporation, and there's some kind of a separate department within that organization. So in this case, IANA is a separate department of ICANN, but it's a wholly owned subsidiary, if you will, a part of ICANN. Structural separation means they're part of a separate organization, an independently managed, owned organization. Oh, I might add to that. So the current IANA contract essentially requires functional separation. And we came up with the idea of structural separation partly because if that contract goes away, what is there to require the separation of these things at all?
Sir.
Thank you. Good morning. Phil Sparborough. I have a pinpoint question for Mr. Kane and one for Fiona. Sure, it's called Depository Incorporated. Pat, you said, I don't know what the replacement will look like. We take our changes from the NTIA. They are responsible for what we do. So my question is, the overall arching impression from all of us, it seems to be that this transfer is going to occur to an unknown, unnamed, perhaps unformed organization. My question is for you. When that occurs, how will you deal with the antitrust liability of being the only issuing or only controlling organization over the root zone? Fiona, for you, I was unclear of your answer. My question is much simpler. Do you feel, as the NTIA, as the Department of Commerce, that you must or are required to seek congressional approval before you transfer this enormous function to some unknown entity? Thank you.
So Phil, before you walk away, I'd like to get some clarification on just what you're asking me.
Well, if you recall the cases that Verisign did and Network Solutions did, there's a PG Media case and the Thomas case. And the answer was in PG Media when the Second Circuit asked the question, from whom do you take your orders? Because if you don't take orders, you're in violation of antitrust. And the answer is, we take our orders from the Department of Commerce. So if you eliminate the Department of Commerce, where's your umbrella for liability?
So essentially right now, the authorizing role comes from, to make changes to the root zone, comes from the NTIA.
Bet it does.
Right. And so currently this process of NTIA walking away, or I shouldn't say walking away, that's come up a couple of times, the NTIA, indicating that you're going to exit from that particular function. What is the replacement? So that's what this process has been to initiate, is to determine what that is. I don't know what that's going to end up looking like between now and September of 2015, or 2 years beyond that, or 2 years beyond that, depending on what the extensions are. So I don't know what the result of this process looks like. So therefore, I'm not sure I can answer specifically the question that you're asking.
And we did make a point to say that not a single person on this panel is a lawyer.
That's probably a good thing. But that leads to Fiona's response, because if Congress doesn't approve this transfer of whatever it is, whether it's a value, whether it's property, whatever it is, if they don't approve it, if NTIA's position is we don't need congressional approval, that I'd like to hear.
So just so everyone understands who Phil is the lawyer at Network Solutions. So he's at the creation of all of this. So he and Becky should be sitting close together, I guess, for old time's sake. But in terms of asking all the non-lawyers a lawyer question, I think, from our perspective, again, just to reiterate, our determination is that this is not a transfer of assets or property or government resources. It's simply once we get a proposal that's acceptable and meets the criteria laid out and enjoys broad community consensus, we would simply be letting the contract expire.
So I take it the answer is no, don't get congressional approval is required.
We have about 2 minutes left, so we have 2 questions at the mics. So let's ask and answer them very quickly. So
I'll try to make it quick. I'm Carrie Dever from the Center for Copyright Integrity. I attended the judiciary hearing, and I was quite surprised to see that ICANN is already stating that this is a done deal. That was not my impression. I want clarification on who the stakeholders are. I dig through documents for transparency. I want clarification on the stakeholders. You're relying on open sourcing. I did some reading and found that there was a chap by the name of John Postel, who actually is the reason that NTIA sort of came about. He decided to teach a lesson and go in and conscript information, and that's where NTIA came about. Now, Tom Marino.
You did have enormous powers.
Let me. I quickly read. I just know that. Then I stand corrected.
Something like this.
Yes, but he's upside down there. So correctly. So it was his action that caused, made some reactions moving forward. But the point, what I'm pointing to, is that Tom Marino asked Fadi, "Is there any chance that someone can come in and do damage?" And I'm paraphrasing. And Fadi went, "No."
Okay.
And I learned about this chap last
John
night.
Postel, yes. Yes, he looks like Father Christmas, but he's not. So the question is, who are the stakeholders, and could some evil tyrant like
Do that again.
John Postel come in and do some damage?
Well, and also the open sourcing, we don't know who these people are, and we don't know what they're embedding as they open source.
Excellent. Quick answers.
So just to clarify, NTI was created, I think, in the 1970s for a variety of things. In this IANA, and the ICANN portfolio is only one small part of what this agency does. Just to be clear, the creation of ICANN and what happened with respect to that, this stems from the framework for electronic commerce under the Clinton administration. I believe it was in 1996. If that's correct. Where the Secretary of Commerce was instructed to privatize and internationalize the domain name system. And this was, the consequences of an assessment of the best way to deal with this technology was to actually get governments out and allow the private sector and other stakeholders to be involved in the management of it. So that's the origins of all of this. I'm not exactly sure what you're reading or referring to with respect to John Postel.
I was looking to find out who the stakeholders are, not have one source. I can build it together.
Maybe we should talk about that. Offline. Otherwise, we just discuss.
Well, she seems to be asking who are the stakeholders involved in this process, and I think that's actually pretty clear from the record of, who goes to ICANN meetings, who participates in those meetings, and so on. It is, well, it is actually, but it's, diffused.
And that's one of those resources that we get up on Twitter. Last question.
Thank you. Courtney Raj from the Committee to Protect Journalists. I'm glad to hear freedom of expression raised by Steve, but I would like to hear more from Fiona. You said that there are parameters by which any transfer of function, to what role does freedom of expression and human rights play into that? And with respect to this multi-stakeholder process, we haven't heard any discussion of the fact that some stakeholders have a lot more resources and power to participate in a very complicated, typically very expensive process, since these meetings happen all over the world. It's very difficult for non-Western civil society, for NGOs, human rights organizations to participate fully in this process. Is there any thought given to how, if you have a multi-stakeholder process, can you ensure that all of those stakeholders could potentially have a more equal voice? Thank you.
Maybe I could just start with, so when I explained what we'd actually done in terms of establishing four key criteria in addition to the intergovernmental solution, the fourth one of those, I think, was to maintain the openness of the internet. So to the extent the domain name system provides and supports free expression and resulting human rights, we would want to make sure that continues, and that's one of the criteria we've laid out. I think the question about how the process is being run and convened, what we saw in Brazil was last week a great participation through remote hubs and things like that, but that might be a better question for ICANN and those actually more directly running the process.
All right, Roger Cachetti's moderating the next panel, and he has a hammer too. So I've gone 2 minutes over my time. So the next panel, we're taking a quick break, I think.
Yeah, we're gonna.
And then we're going to get to the next panel, which is possible scenarios for the future of IANA functions. What are the implications for internet governance? So going forward, so to speak, I really appreciate GW and ISOC for inviting me to help moderate this panel today. And I want to thank a really respectful, collegial, and really intelligent panel.
All right, we're going to take now a 13-minute break or a 15-minute bathroom break and coffee break. There's coffee in the back and pastries.